If you have interest in credibility and expectations, you are in the correct place. I will give a presentation about this subject. I am Elder Ferreira de Mendonça, full professor of economics at Fluminense Federal University and researcher at the National Council for Scientific and Technological Development in Brazil. This presentation summarizes some of the main ideas in my paper published in Journal of Policy Modeling entitled Credibility and Inflation Expectations: What We Can Tell from 7 Emerging Economies. This study is a contribution to the literature concerning credibility and its effect on the distribution between forward-looking behavior and backward-looking behavior for formation of inflation expectations. I'm taking into account data gathered from 7 inflation target emerging economies: Brazil, Chile, Colombia, Mexico, Poland, Turkey, and South Africa. In particular, I analyzed the distribution of expectation between forward-looking and backward-looking behavior. In other words, I'm interested to check how much the credibility associated with the inflation target contributes to anchoring expectations. The findings denote that although credibility is relevant to reduce inflation expectations, these countries present low monetary credibility, and thus the backward-looking behavior is predominant for the formation of inflation expectations. In short, current inflation target in emerging economies is not able to anchor inflation expectations. Why several researchers are still studying inflation targeting? The answer is quite simple. Inflation is like an incurable disease, and thus it needs control. Inflation hurts the society. It decreases households' purchase power and investments, and also it increases macroeconomic instability and social inequality. The main causes of inflation are demand shocks, supply shocks, and expectations. The traditional remedy used against inflation is the increase in the monetary policy interest rate. The main problem with this procedure is that it implies a collateral effect, that is, an increase in the sacrifice ratio. Nowadays, there exists a consensus that credibility is a key tool for managing monetary policy, and that the success of the monetary policy depends on the extent to which the expectations of the public are reshaped by the announced targets. The essence of credibility is the belief by the public in the probability of a successful execution of a policy. In the context of inflation targeting, there is no doubt that credibility is a forward-looking concept, and it is directly connected with inflation expectations. In the case of inflation targeting, inflation expectations are the heart of the system. The main idea is that the success of inflation targeting can represent a lower social cost, because the disinflation process can be reached through a decrease in inflation expectations without an increase in the interest rate. Hence, how to achieve this performance? Credibility is the answer to this question. A natural positive issue that concerns monetary policymakers that make use of inflation targeting is how the public responds to the announced targets. When the public believes in the announced targets, and thus there exists credibility, inflation expectations are anchored, and the central bank is able to guide expectations. An important question is how to measure credibility. In a simple way, credibility can be measured by the difference between inflation expectations and the target. My favorite definition is made by Cookman and Melton in Econometrica. Credibility is a result of the absolute value of the difference between the policymakers' plans and the public's beliefs about those plans. Some years after, Blinden in the American Review states that a central bank is credible if people believe it will do what it says. In practice, credibility represents the convergence from inflation expectation to the target over time. Although the previous definition is attractive, it's hard to apply it in the case of emerging economies. Most central banks in emerging economies do not have inflation expectation series. Even in the case of central banks that have inflation expectation series, They are available only for the short time horizon, current year. Therefore, constrained by available information from central banks, take into account quarterly data, I'm using information from Brazil, Chile, Colombia, Mexico, Poland, South Africa, and Turkey. It's important to remember that the central banks in these countries make use of tolerance intervals, and this implies advantage. For example, central banks can stabilize the economy. However, this implies disadvantage because systematic deviation from the target decreases credibility, and the consequence is more time to achieve price stability. The graphs in figure show how inflation expectations are close to the target, and if they are inside the tolerance intervals over time. The dotted red lines are the tolerance intervals, the upper and lower bounds. The green lines are the inflation targets, and the blue lines are the inflation expectations. In general, it's observed that inflation expectations, with the exception of Chile and Poland, have been persistently above the target. Furthermore, in all cases, there are periods where inflation expectations exceed the tolerance intervals. In particular, it seems that the strong international crisis, 2007-2008, was responsible for this observation in most cases. One important question in this analysis is how to measure credibility. As pointed out by Blindley 2000, if the central bank has an explicit, publicly announced target for some variable, for example inflation, then the gap between the target and market expectations can be taken as an objective measure of credibility. Based on this idea, the literature offers several indices that takes into account the magnitude of the difference between the public inflation expectations and the inflation targets. In this sense, credibility is high when there exists convergence between inflation expectations and the target. Chequet and Crowd 2002 proposed a well-known index. This index indicates maximum credibility when the inflation expectation is equal to or less than the target. In contrast, the index denotes no credibility when inflation expectations exceed 20%. After this limit, the authors assume that the monetary authority loses the control over inflation. In this framework, credibility decreases as inflation expectations deviate from the target and approach 20%. In the state of the empirical analysis with credibility indices, similar to Bonfim and Broadbush 2000, Borden-Ciclus 2016, builds a central bank credibility index that takes into consideration the deviation of inflation expectations and the time-varying inflation targets. Moreover, the authors assume an interval of 1% around the inflation target. The authors consider that the loss of credibility is greater when expectations miss the target outside the interval. The previous indices are a good representation of the empirical literature on central bank credibility. However, they fall short for analysis concerning credibility in inflation target in emerging economies. Chequet and Crowd's index considers the unreal limit of 20% for a central bank not to have credibility. It's important to highlight that the adoption of inflation target is clearly a commitment by the central bank in an attempt to keep the inflation at acceptable levels, normally an inflation lower than 2 digits. Furthermore, this index attributes maximum credibility when the expected inflation is lower than the target. This assumption is not acceptable because some emerging economies, as, for example, that of Poland, have experienced deflation, which in turn obviously is a problem. The index, presented by Bonfim and Broadbush, as well as by Borden-Ciclus, has as an essential component a target range of 1%. This is a drawback, because it's not reasonable simply to neglect the inflation intervals that are announced by each central bank, because the inflation intervals are part of the inflation target system in most countries. In order to analyze monetary policy credibility performance in inflation targeting emerging economies, a good index must comprehend its framework. How the expected inflation for at least 1 year ahead converge to the announced target for the same period, whether inflation expectations are inside or outside of the tolerance intervals stated by the central bank. The use of information that is available from central banks, the case of economic transparency. The presentation of the outcome is intuitive, that it permits the time series of the index being up to date, easy to compute, and proving as a successful application for the case of inflation targeting emerging economies. A time-varying monetary credibility index that fits well for this analysis is that introduced by de Mendonça 2007 in Applied Economics and de Mendonça and Galvez 2013 in Economic Systems. The index proposed by these authors fills up all points mentioned earlier. In particular, it has already been used in application for several emerging economies, for example, Brazil, Colombia, Poland, Turkey, Tunisia, Paraguay, and others. In brief, the index makes use of the public's forward-looking behavior on inflation and represents a useful tool for measuring the public's trust vis-à-vis the ability of the central bank to achieve the inflation target. In specific, credibility is maximum when the inflation expectation for the next 4 quarters is exactly the inflation 4 quarters ahead. In the case where the inflation exceeds the limits of the tolerance intervals stated by the central bank, credibility is null. The index assumes a value between 0 and 1 when inflation expectations are inside the interval, and decrease as expectations deviate from the target. Hence, this index shows how much expectations are anchored to the inflation target. This figure shows the performance of the monetary credibility of the countries in the analysis. In general, the performance is not good. The average credibility index for all countries is 0.34. The positive highlight is the Chilean economy, average of 0.7. Brazil and Colombia have an intermediate position. Average credibility is 0.47 and 0.44 respectively, but the index presents a clear deterioration in the last period. Although Mexico presents a trend of improvement in the index over time, the average is low, 0.24. The negative highlights are Poland, Turkey, and South Africa. Average credibility index is 0.19, 0.18, and 0.14 respectively. This result is particularly interesting because it reveals that while Turkey and South Africa fight against inflation expectations greater than the upper bound, Poland has the opposite situation, inflation expectations lower than the lower bound. At the end, it's possible to see that all countries present a good performance in some moments. However, with the exception of Chile, they are not able to maintain this level. Take into account the convergence of inflation expectation to inflation target and make some adaptations in a simple rule for inflation expectation that is common in the literature. See, for example, Bonfim and Brodebush 2000, Journal of Monetary and Banking, Tesfaye-Selassie and Schalling 2010 in Journal of Economic Dynamic Control, and Newkirch and Tillman 2014 in Journal of International Money and Finance. The effect of the monetary credibility can be analyzed through a convex combination between the inflation target 4 quarters ahead and the distributed lag of past inflation in the last 4 quarters. In this framework, credibility is the weight of the inflation target in the determination of inflation expectations, and the lack of credibility is the weight of past inflation rates. The interpretation is straightforward. In the case of full credibility, the term regarding past inflation is not relevant, and thus inflation expectations are completely anchored to the inflation target. In contrast, where there is no credibility, inflation target is not relevant, and thus inflation expectation is a result of past inflation. When there exists a credibility but is not maximum, that is, credibility index is between 0 and 1, inflation expectations are a result of the combination of both inflation target and past inflation. In brief, this framework permits observing how much of the inflation expectations is explained by the inflation target and the past inflation, considering the credibility effect. Although the previous idea is compelling, the main challenge is how to introduce a measure of credibility in equation 2. However, this is not a problem if the credibility index is that suggested by de Mendonça 2007 in Applied Economics. Besides the advantage of using this credibility index, the fact that the index has a score between 0 and 1 is a perfect match to be applied in this framework. With information on inflation expectations, inflation target, inflation, and credibility in hand, almost everything is ready for the analysis. The inconvenience is the lack of information regarding the coefficient of past inflation in equation 2. In order to overcome this situation, equation 2 is rewritten, putting as dependent variable past inflation. Now, it's easy to obtain the parameters regarding past inflation through a simple estimation. After finding these parameters, it's possible to build the time series on inflation expectation for equation 2. The figure shows the result of this application for the 7 countries under analysis. The graph suggests that inflation expectation computed through equation 2, blue lines in the graphs, represent a good approximation to those gathered from survey of expectations of each central bank. Although inflation expectation obtained from equation 2 seem well adjusted to inflation expectation available from the central banks, the quality of the forecast needs to be checked. With this objective, the forecast error is computed as a result of the difference between the inflation expectation for the next 4 quarters gathered from central banks and the forecast of the expectations computed from equation 2. Furthermore, mean error and mean absolute error are presented as statistics regarding the quality of the forecasts. The average of the forecast errors, mean error, denotes magnitude and direction of the projections, while mean absolute error is related to accuracy of the forecasts. In addition, based on Holding Peel 1990 in Manchester School, I made a test for unbiasedness and a test for autocorrelation through Lagrange multiplier. The results in figure indicate that, with the exception of Colombia and Mexico, the projections making use of equation 2 underestimate the inflation expectation from central banks, positive forecast error. However, the results of the statistical test indicate that the use of equation 2 to forecast inflation expectation has good quality. In all countries, mean absolute error is lower than 1, and the unbiasedness and autocorrelation tests approve the efficiency of the forecast. Since inflation expectation obtained from equation 2 represent a good proxy for inflation expectation made available from central banks, it is possible to observe how the interaction between inflation target and credibility explains the expectations. In this context, it is possible to make a decomposition of inflation expectation as computed from equation 2 and to see whether inflation expectations are a result of a backward-looking process. In other words, this case would represent a situation where the lack of credibility implies that the past inflation determines the expectations. In contrast, if the credibility is maximum, case of a forward-looking process, there is a perfect convergence of expectation to the inflation targets, and thus, the central bank has the power to anchor expectations. The figure shows the decomposition of inflation expectation based on equation 2. Black bars correspond to forward-looking behavior, while gray bars correspond to backward-looking behavior. The result is impressive. With the exception of Chile, which presents a very good performance in anchoring inflation expectations, the other countries present a frustrating performance. The problem, especially in the Brazilian case, is that the central banks reduce the attention on inflation, and the result is the deterioration in expectations in the last period. In contrast, Mexico seems to be improving the central bank's commitment to the inflation targets, and the result is an increasing ability to anchor expectations. Colombia and Brazil did not present a very bad performance over time. However, the case of Poland, Turkey, and South Africa showed that only very few periods did inflation targets associated with credibility have the ability to contribute to the formation of inflation expectations. Although the results seem different, the problem is quite the same. That is, with the exception of Chile, all countries in the sample fail to provide a monetary policy that is able to anchor inflation expectations to the target over the time. The previous analysis assumed the rule present in equation 2 for inflation expectations. However, it is possible that credibility does not have a significant role in determination of expectations. In order to observe if the monetary policy credibility is, in fact, relevant to inflation expectations, I present estimations for inflation expectations based on two variations of equation 2. One model, which considers the inflation target 4 quarters ahead and the average of past inflation in the last 4 quarters, and a second model, which takes into account the credibility effect on inflation expectations through an interactive term with inflation targets. These specifications permit checking if the introduction of the credibility in the model improves the forecast of the inflation expectations. This can be observed through a measure of accuracy, root mean square error, and the adjusted coefficient of determination. In the case where the model with the presence of the credibility, model 2, implies a lower root mean square error and a greater adjusted coefficient of determination, there is an indication that the introduction of credibility improves the forecast. Furthermore, take into consideration the usual case where inflation expectations are greater than inflation targets, a negative parameter on the interactive term between credibility and inflation target means that credibility contributes to decreasing inflation expectations and thus helps to the convergence to the target. The results in the table indicate that for all countries, the model with credibility presents better results, greater adjusted coefficient of determination, and lower root mean square error. In addition, the parameter of the interaction term between credibility and inflation target is negative and has statistical significance in all cases. Therefore, there exists evidence that credibility represents a good thing when the objective is to anchor inflation expectations. In other words, independent of the country in the sample, the conduct of monetary policy concerned with the convergence between inflation expectation and the announced target is a key piece for the success of inflation targeting. The findings in this study present a direct practical implication for the conduct of the monetary policy in emerging economies that makes use of inflation targeting. The main observation is that only adopting inflation target is not enough to anchor inflation expectations. Although all countries in this study announce inflation targets, the lack of commitment of the central bank to the targets is unacceptable. With the exception of Chile, the emerging economies in this study are not able to maintain regularity in guiding inflation expectations to the inflation targets. The result is that the countries present low monetary credibility and, consequently, inflation expectations are determined in large measure by past inflation. In short, almost all countries in the sample reveal a poor performance of monetary policy under inflation targeting. This is a clear example of time inconsistency problem and the traditional Lucas critique. What should be done to reduce the lack of capacity to anchor inflation expectations? Credibility is imperative for countries with inflation targets. This is not magic, but a result of the commitment of the central banks to the target. Hence, it's mandatory to find mechanisms that can improve the expectations channel of monetary policy in emerging economies under inflation targeting. In this sense, a rule of thumb for emerging market central banks is to improve the transparency policy. Thank you for your patience.